Welcome to Reimagining Liberty, a show about the emancipatory and cosmopolitan case for radical liberalism. I'm Aaron Ross Powell. The rise of Nick Fuentes, the self-immolation of the Heritage Foundation, the Great Replacement conspiracy theorizing endemic on X. The right very clearly has a significant anti-Semitism problem, with anti-Jewish hate spreading from the fringes to the conservative mainstream and out into the broader political culture. And this hate interacts with, supports, and leads to further hate, directed at other groups, including misogyny, racism, and ethnic and religious nationalism. On today's episode, I brought on Elad Nehorai. He's a writer, activist, and social and political commentator, and founder of Justice Marketing. We have a deep conversation about the role anti-Semitism plays in the ideologies of the contemporary right, how their continued use of X is normalizing such views among American journalists and media elites, and the prospect of a post-Trump GOP drifting even further into outright neo-Nazism. Reimagining Liberty is a listener-supported show. If you value these conversations and want to listen to them a week early, you can become a patron. You'll get a special early access feed of the show, and you'll get my weekly roundup of my latest writing as well. Head to patreon.com/Aaron Ross Powell to learn more, or look for a link in the show notes. With that, let's turn to my conversation with Elad. So the far right has, for quite some time, been pretty anti-Semitic. It has a history of such things. And the far right has also, for quite some time, been the mainstream of the American right, at least since Trump came to power the first time around, and its mainstreamness within the American right and kind of forcing out other versions of conservatism has accelerated since Trump came back into power. So what's different now? It feels like something is different now as far as anti-Semitism on the right, but what's different from its kind of constant presence that we've seen going back years or decades?
Yeah, I think there's a combination of things that happened almost all at once. One is was October 7th and the war and genocide that followed. That opened up a huge array of splits all over the place. It became a wedge issue everywhere, not just on the right. And that actually offered a huge opportunity to far-right actors because generally speaking, they've been very effective overall at kind of what, like I'm a marketer and what we would call newsjacking, like taking something that's trending and making it seem and just kind of riding that. The far right does that all the time. And October 7th, and the war just led to a massive amount of that occurring because it was constantly in the news. So it had less to do with ideology and more to do with opportunism. So someone like Candace Owens, who was always anti-Semitic, kind of got an opportunity to really mainstream her views by just talking about Israel a lot. And ironically, all the things people say about the left, when they say the word Zionism, they mean Jews. When they, are saying they're anti-Zionist, they actually mean they're anti-Semitic. Like on the right, and especially on the far right, that's actually extremely accurate because in that case, it's not accidental. It is a purposeful form of propaganda. And it's also one that's done to appeal to the left. So that's one thing. The other thing is that shortly before that, Elon Musk had bought X, or at that time, Twitter. So what happened at that time was all these people who had been deplatformed, people like Nick Fuentes, and many others, Andrew Anglin, who started Daily Stormer, and David Icke, I could go on and on. It's neo-Nazis, anti-Semites in general, all of a sudden who were completely deplatformed on almost all social media channels, had a social media channel that they could post on, not only post on, but post on without moderation. And that led to a transformation. In particular, I think Nick Fuentes is a perfect example. He started from zero and went to 100,000, 200,000. Now he's growing and growing into hundreds of thousands, and growing at a rapid pace. And that combined with the influential power of being on that medium, it's still unfortunately a very influential medium, has led to him becoming mainstream. It's not, and Tucker Carlson, kind of letting him on was really just an extension of that. And that combined with one last thing was just there's been an overall constant Overton shift on the right, which is to target one group, then another. By focusing on one after the other, they've been able to get us to fight each other, get us to not stand with other groups and not realize that we're all in this together. And so Jews were kind of always on that list, especially since conspiracy theories almost by definition, or most of them, tend to center on anti-Semitic conspiracy theories with code words replacing them. And at some point that was going to shift. You can't talk about Soros and globalists and cultural Marxists and one world government and all these things that are centered around Jews without eventually making it about Jews. That's partly just like historical momentum. It also has a lot to do with the fact that many of the people who are most spreading these conspiracy theories know what they're doing and ultimately do want to hurt Jews. So we're kind of reaching that shift. I think it would have happened anyway. Or I'm sure it would have happened anyway. I think it was just the pace was really pushed forward because of all those other factors.
On the conspiratorial stuff, you mentioned David Icke, and maybe using him as an example of what this looks like in practice. Because if listeners have heard of him, it might be he's the guy who thinks reptiles control the world and that all of the major powerful families and politicians are secretly reptilians, like that old show V. That doesn't sound it sounds crazy, but it's about reptiles, not Jews.
It is and it isn't, right? I mean, I think there's once you kind of enter into that space, he almost always he mentions Jews in different framing. He doesn't necessarily focus it completely on the lizard part of it, but there is a strong connection in his conspiratorial view to Jews. That's a big reason that there was a big reaction to, I'm trying to remember her name, but there was a civil rights leader who was a big believer in David Icke's conspiracy theories, and that became a big controversy because of his anti-Semitism. And that led to, the ADL calling her out and all these things. So it's true. It's interesting. Icke is an interesting example. I think people like Icke, I think, are so like, I mean, they're less fringe than you would think, but people like Fuentes are the ones I'm more concerned about because they're much more calculated and thoughtful than someone like him who's, anyway.
Can you talk about the rise of Fuentes? Because he's another guy who, I mean, people who've been paying attention to these corners of the internet saw him coming from early on. But if you look at him, he's this kind of like just loser guy. He's bound up in the incel stuff, which is not like a wildly charismatic movement. He broadcasts from what looks like, or at least used to, from what looked like his kind of sorry bedroom. Who is this guy? Like he's wildly anti-Semitic. And yet Tucker Carlson's platforming him. The Heritage Foundation is currently in full-on meltdown over their president, Kevin Roberts, effectively defending Tucker Carlson, platforming Nick Fuentes. Like, who is this sorry little guy who seems to have gotten so much attention and such a huge following?
Yeah, I mean, we used to say similar things about Trump, right? Like he's a clown, he's a weirdo. Look at how he acts. Like it seems so insane. We thought it wasn't charismatic, and yet he had a big hold on, or has a big hold on people. And amazingly, the hold has only strengthened in many cases, at least with his hardcore followers. And Fuentes, I think, to me, why he's so appealing to a certain group of people is that he's kind of the typification of the edgelord idea of the far right, which is to be charismatic in that context is to, be someone who is effective at kind of leaning into that, I wouldn't say necessarily loser image, but the image of someone who's like just likes to be, a bad mouth, likes to get canceled, likes to get, likes to be offensive. He's the typification of that, and in many ways, like one of the biggest leaders in pushing that perspective. And so if you see, I just saw this interview on Instagram, like an influencer was just kind of interviewing people in colleges. And there was this one kid who he interviewed who just, kind of blamed everything on the Jews. And it was really interesting because he seemed very Fuentes, like he seemed to, he kind of grinned and was having fun. And he didn't know that the interviewer happened to be Jewish. And he was kind of like, you could see he was kind of enjoying, forming this anti-institutional identity. And I think Fuentes is really important in that case, because, or in that example, because the really part of the aspect that we're seeing in terms of anti-Semitism is that it's really, I would say, an outgrowth on a deeper level of the anti-institutional side of the far right. Ultimately, the far right is really about destroying institutions and taking them over. And so for the most part, they've been very effective with that, especially when it comes to minorities and racism and these kind of things. And one of the last things left, and which Israel and the war made extremely apparent, was, this is kind of the last bastion of institutionalism on the right, which is, especially when it comes to minority groups. So having someone like Fuentes kind of be out there is a really good example of how ultimately it's not so much what they're for as much as what they're against, what they're trying to destroy. And in many ways, Israel, and of course by extension to the far right, Jews, are seen as that last institutional piece that has to fall.
Does this mean there's an element of the destruction, like everything is just downstream from the destruction, like the hatred? So it's not necessarily like anti-Semitism per se that's motivating them, or young men getting bound up in this, but just a desire to destroy and dominate, and ridicule and troll, like getting the lulz, as I don't know if they still call it that, but back in the something awful days and whatnot, that it was just, you said the things that upset people, and like the content of what you said wasn't really as important as just the fact that you were upsetting people. And so you triangulated on the things that were most upsetting, and anti-Semitism is really justifiably upsetting. Is there an element of that it's like performance to anger people versus actual beliefs about hatred of Jews? Or, I mean, we could tell a story of other groups. Like, and I'm not saying to try to like downplay, but it seems like if we're then like, how do you respond to this? What does the future look like? Those two stories would seem to point in different potential directions as far as like how sticky it is, or how much it persists, or how much they stick around with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the best way to see this has been, they've the far right, and back in the day when we called them the alt right, have always had a approach to this that I think is meant to make us feel like they don't believe in it. That's kind of the point of the lulls and the irony, the extreme joking. All of that is kind of, among other things, is meant to kind of lower our defenses, to not take it as seriously, and to be like, oh, they're just doing it for reaction. I think they are doing it, of course, for reaction, especially among like kind of the edge case followers and that kind of thing. But I think we shouldn't downplay the fact that these are people who truly hate other groups, especially like the closer you get to the hardcore movement, the more it really does revolve around hate. It revolves around other things like you're describing. It's not like, I don't think they're in conflict. I think, in fact, they kind of support each other. The jokes help them feel like they're hurting the groups that they hate, and also give them attention, and also disarm people. I mean, I think that was kind of, Trump was the early example of this, where a lot of people just thought he was a clown, thought he was just saying jokes to be offensive. And then at the end of the day, we see his policies, he is as racist as, he claimed to be from the beginning.
It seems like that too ties into like one of the one of the cultural failures we've witnessed over, I mean, certainly over the Trump years, but in the rise of the alt-right, is how much kind of elite culture overlooked or played footsie with a lot of this stuff. Like, you go back and you can see a lot of these guys getting kind of puff piece interviews, or there was a story years back about these in the New Yorker, I think it was, about these like dinner parties for like edgy people, edgy media elites, who were, like, these are the dinner parties where we can say the things that you can't get away with saying. And they were just like the most kind of banal, like conservative right wing points, not, but they felt edgy to them. And it has felt like there's been this real appeal to basically bored elites. They were bored with the liberal consensus, and the being niceness that came out of it. And these edgy guys were saying things that were upsetting people. But I think so. That's where I think your point about, like, we don't want to downplay that they really believe it. It felt like we kind of ended up here, at least in elite stuff, because there was a lot of downplaying that they believed it because it was edgy, and the edginess was like a way to route around the tedium of, just end of history sort of liberal consensus. But that's changing. Like, it seems like now you see them like kind of, oh crap, these guys actually meant it.
Yeah.
I'm curious then to turn back to Elon Musk and X, because that story seems to be persisting there. Like, I'm always distressed at how many people are still hanging out on X, are still like mainlining it as their source of understanding of the world and political culture and the political consensus as it becomes more and more extreme. So how bad are things there? I guess before we get to like why this is happening and why people are comfortable with it, like, how bad is it over there?
Yeah, it's so weird to see it be exactly what I warned it would be. And I don't mean, it's not meant to be self-congratulating, like quite the opposite. It's very surreal, because early on when Musk bought Twitter, even when I kind of like it was earlier stage and he was kind of only lightly spreading Soros conspiracy theories. Back then I said, if he really did stick to his free speech absolutism, that was really going to become 4chan, but mainstream. And now we see not only is he, he's really not being a free speech absolutist. What he's doing is uplifting the far right. What we're seeing is kind of a hyper quickened version of 4chan spreading, everywhere. And spreading with real names and spreading, in a way that is getting into our institutional ways of approaching things, getting into journalists' heads, it's getting into politicians' heads, and it's reaching, a bigger array of people than you might expect. I think one of the things I, was really keeping an eye on during this process, especially post October 7th, was the way, as I mentioned earlier, kind of Fuentes and others were very effective at reaching out to the left. And now you'll see, I on Instagram, for example, I'll see people sharing clips of Candace Owens, Tucker Carlson, and sometimes even Fuentes, with, sometimes giving them credit, sometimes not, but we're just kind of seeing them enter mainstream discourse more, and liberal discourse even. So in terms of how bad it is, honestly, I think it's as bad as most people imagine. You go on there, you will almost immediately see neo-Nazi content. You'll almost immediately see anti-Semitic content, anti-trans, racist. I mean, it's always been bad on Twitter even before Musk. But really, it's just become, being a neo-Nazi on Twitter is just part of the discourse now. It's not something that you have to hide around. You have to like code, or something you have to change and move around. And not only that, I think the far right and the right are very effective at working together on different levels. So what I mean by that is, in effect, I would argue that, and I've said this for a while, I would argue that Tucker Carlson's beliefs are not that different from Nick Fuentes. He just has been very good at seemingly being being in the, how do I say it? Like in the more respectable spheres and being able to also to make edge things that were once edge like mainstream. So he was one of the biggest proponents of great replacement back when it was still considered taboo. And now something like 70% or more of Republicans believe in great replacement. Conspiracy theory is just, I mean, our entire government now is built around the great replacement conspiracy theory. So, I think so. What I mean by that is essentially Fuentes can work in his extreme level. Tucker Carlson can sound more respectable. And then eventually, as the Overton window shifts, can bring someone like Fuentes on, and it can be extremely controversial, but he's not getting deplatformed. He's just getting more attention. By he, I mean Tucker Carlson. And so that creates a place. Twitter becomes this place where multiple voices can work together to achieve propaganda against to target different audiences. So you can have someone like Tucker Carlson appealing to the mainstream right, and people are kind of afraid of being openly anti-Semitic. And then you have Fuentes, who's kind of bringing the edgelords on, and then together bringing them into one space. So that's happening there, and then that spreads to other social media channels, which makes it all the worse.
How much of this is people feeling more empowered to say hateful things openly, express hateful ideas, which we certainly have seen? Like, that's been one of the effects of Trump, is that a lot of people who were racist, were anti-Semitic, were misogynistic, and so on, but kind of kept it on the down low because of social desirability and social norms. When those change, now we're like, okay, I am free to speak my mind. I can say the N word without consequence again, and so on. Uh, how much of what we're seeing is that versus the actual like spreading of these hateful beliefs? More people are anti-Semitic or racist or misogynist, or whatever category we're looking at in any given moment, than they used to be. Give a sense of that?
Yeah, I think it's both. As I said before, I think that the reason, people like myself and others were pushing for more moderation on places like Twitter well before Musk bought it is because we know that the more people can openly be anti-Semitic and racist, the more likely that is to spread them, because it becomes, as you mentioned, becomes more normalized, and it becomes less taboo. So the truth is, even if people feel racist, feel anti-Semitic before, something like, I mean, it's hard to even imagine now, but stuff like great replacement, depending on how it was worded, could be, could be stopped through moderation. And that really meant that it's not only about open bigotry, but things like conspiracy theories before had to be coded. You had to use Soros and you had to use these replacements. But as moderation reduces and as the culture evolves and open bigotry is less of an issue, then you can start to actually connect the dots in a way that before would have to happen on like another platform like Telegram. So what we're seeing is, everything being scaled, bigotry being scaled, conspiracy theories being scaled. And what that does is it feeds each other. So as more people believe in it, more people say it. And as more people say it, more people believe in it.
And that would seem then to route around, one of the arguments for why platforms were moderating back in the moderation wars several years back, when everyone was mad at platforms for moderating and had Twitter files, conspiracy theories about them, and so on. Uh, One of the arguments for the platforms moderating was, look, most people at, Gab and Parler and the other hard right Twitter alternatives were not very popular comparatively. And part of the reason they weren't popular is, the argument went, lots of people, like most people, don't want to hang out in a cesspit. They don't want to hang out in a Nazi bar. And so if you are a corporation running a platform that has to sell ads and needs its user numbers to go up, and its, monthly active users to be high and so on, you have a market incentive to moderate, simply so that you don't drive away all of your business. But it feels like what's happened, particularly in the last couple of years and exemplified by Musk buying Twitter, is that market pressure has broken. Like, Musk doesn't really seem to care about if he's funding Twitter out of his own pocket or through, shuffling money between his various corporations, in order for it to be a platform for far right hate speech. It's not being run as a business effectively. Otherwise, he'd be changing his behavior because it bleeds user numbers and so on. Um, it seems like that has shifted, or the arguments about investing in VCs investing in platforms like Substack, which has no clear path to profitability. It loses extraordinary amounts of money. It probably can never become profitable, but it's a way to mainstream a set of ideas that the wealthy investors want to have mainstreamed. And so it's not really about market pressures. Um, and that seems like a problem. But the other part of it, and I'm curious for your thoughts on this, is why people haven't been driven away more. Like, if Twitter is as bad as you say it is, and you've written about the actual data on how bad it is, like the data is pretty clear about how much anti-Semitism and other kinds of hate are present on the platform. Why are so many influential people, journalists, politicians, think tankers, who, if you ask them, like, do you like far right hate speech? Do you like neo Nazi content? They'd say no. If you ask them if they shared these beliefs, they'd say no. Are still there, are still posting away, are not leaving the platform that's turning into Gab or Parler or 4chan or 8chan or whatever dark corner of Telegram we might think of.
Yeah, I think observers have difficulty grasping the power of network effects. So I think part of the reason people didn't go on Gab was that they didn't want to be in a hate-filled space. The other reason is that they were niche places. Just as right now we're seeing you and I like interacted on Blue Sky. Blue Sky is essentially, I would argue, like the liberal left version of what Gab and Parler were. It's not just that people don't want to be in a bigoted space. It's also that people don't want to be stuck in a very narrow bubble. So things like Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, we attribute their success to things like tech or moderation. But the truth is their actual success is based off the fact they were there first. Because they were there first, they actually, if you noticed, I'm sure most of us have noticed that Facebook is a relatively miserable experience. Instagram can be miserable. All these places are not great. Most of us don't actually like them. And the reason we stick to them is because, so when I say the word network effects, what I actually mean is that like we're there because other people are there. So a politician stays there because other politicians are there. A journalist stays there because politicians are there and they can hear straight from them. And a lot of the people who are on mainstream followers are just there because that's where the politicians and the journalists and the celebrities and all these people are. And those people, the far right, the politicians and journalists are interacting with each other there, which is something that, I'll say as someone who I'll just give myself as an example. I left Twitter. I had 60,000 followers at the time, and it was kind of my main play, my voice. That was the place where I found my voice, where people found me. And so leaving Twitter was like I didn't even I knew that it would be a sacrifice, but I am still feeling the sacrifice happen. Part of that would have happened anyway because of what Twitter has become, and because of the suppression of voices like mine. And I'll argue that I still would have had a lot of what I lost when I left. So I feel, in many ways, I feel much less plugged in than I did when I was on Twitter. That's actually been healthy for me. So I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad thing on a personal level, but it's a bad thing if we're talking about the influence we want to have in the mainstream and making something like Twitter die. But I do agree there's another aspect to this, which is, as you mentioned, Elon Musk buying Twitter and billionaires being involved with this on an ideological level shifts everything enormously. When Jack Dorsey, was in charge of Twitter, people forget, but there was actually a stage where I wouldn't say it was as bad as this, but it was pretty bad. And that's how Gamergate happened. There was this, there was a huge attack on women that evolved from a dispute in the gaming world. And that led to a group of people leaving because they didn't want to be in a bigoted space. So it is, what you're saying is true to an extent. People did leave, and it became less active. People didn't want to be as involved in conversation, and revenue went down. And that ultimately led to a lot of moderation changes, because if a company is trying to maximize profit, they do need to have some level of moderation. But as you say, Musk doesn't have, that same pressure. I actually myself led multiple campaigns to try to get advertisers to reduce spending there. And it actually succeeded here and there. I mean, there were other campaigns as well, and the pressure worked to an extent in terms of the advertisers, but it had virtually no effect on Elon Musk. And so we have this combination of factors that make it very hard to make something like Twitter become what we hope it becomes, which is a niche place where only the far right exists. I mean, honestly, that's bad enough too. But so what I would argue is going to happen over time, as I do think people are going to keep leaving Twitter, but I think it's going to be a much slower trickle than other people had hoped or expected. And I think people need to kind of hold that, to be aware with what they're dealing with, and be honest that they are sacrificing something by not being on Twitter if they decide to stay off of it. I don't think there's anything wrong with it. As I said, I left. But it does mean that you are less plugged in, and that has a lot to do with network effects. There's a logical reason for wanting to stay on Twitter.
Yeah, I left. I think I left when there was the first round of letting back on the Nazis who had been banned, and that was when I was like, I'm out. And I like Blue Sky a lot, and there's lots of cool people there, and it feels a lot better than Twitter does now. But you're right. Like, yes, you're giving up. There are people who I would like to be connected to who I am not connected to in that way anymore because they didn't move over to the new place that I happen to be at. So that's just to call everyone come to Blue Sky, because it's pretty nice over there. But even as it shrinks, though, like this is the influence thing, and the widespreadness thing. And this is what this episode came about because you had posted something on Blue Sky about the widespreadness of the hate. And I think I had, and the long termness of this, that we were seeing a real shift in a really ugly direction. And I had expressed like maybe a bit more optimism that this stuff was like so ugly that I thought there was going to be a hard turn against it. And when I was preparing for this episode, I was thinking about like the widespreadness of the influence, and I checked, like Nick Fuentes has 1.2 million followers on Twitter right now, which is a lot. That's it's more than I ever had. But like, I'm a fan of the YouTube channel Red Letter Media, where they talk about bad movies. Red Letter Media has 1.6 million followers on YouTube and is not a political movement, and probably couldn't become one if it wanted to, but it's bigger than Nick Fuentes. So is the danger then, the absolute numbers seem relatively small. Like when you compare them to other things, like how many people are watching the NBC nightly news each night, or watching MSNBC, or reading lots of other influencers. But that is the real danger, that there are all of these people who are propagators, like Tucker Carlson is there and picking up this stuff and then spreading it out to the Heritage Foundation, which is then spreading it out to the world, or that these politicians are there and viewing Twitter as kind of the real world, even if it's a vanishingly small representation of a slice of it. Is that the danger? Like, it's like Fuentes in the scheme of things doesn't have that many followers. That's what like I wonder about, is how big can this guy get? How big can this stuff get if the numbers are so relatively small?
I actually just wrote a piece in the forward about this topic, which is that I think we're continuing to make the mistake of looking at individuals. I know I talk about Fuentes a lot, so I'm in that camp to an extent. But what we need to see is, and part of the reason I talk about like Tucker Carlson relation to Nick Fuentes and Candace Owens is, that's a very small slice of an example of the vast network that the far right has. Like, so point being, we need to focus less on individuals when we're talking about the scale of this than the networks that they're part of. So Media Matters did a really important study on this. I think it was like came out like a year or two ago. I think it was shortly after the election, I believe, but it's definitely worth looking at, because what they pointed out there was how large the far right is in terms of audience, or I should say the right is in terms of audience. So a lot of us, a lot of people are focusing on Joe Rogan as this kind of like big voice. He's the reason Trump won. But when you look at the numbers, they kind of did this graphical representation, with different circles representing the size. And the truth is, if you took Joe Rogan out of that group, there would still be a bigger right-wing audience, or still a bigger audience listening to the right than the left. And that just has to do with the fact that the right is very good at building lots of niches and reaching out to lots of different groups. So another issue that we have on the left is we talk very often purely in political terms. So someone like Nick Fuentes, all his content is political. Everything he says is political. But Nick Fuentes was also part of the way he became connected to a larger group of people, and especially kind of edgy young guys, is because he was on a lot of like Manosphere podcasts. So the Manosphere, for those who don't know, is kind of this, kind of angry, like manly group of like people on the right trying to bring back manliness to America. And that group is then connected to MMA, right? There's a lot of people who are in MMA who are part of the Manosphere. And then you
mixed martial arts.
Right. And then that group, right. And then that group can be very connected to comedy, right? There's a lot of people in comedy on the right that are mainstreaming this, which is where Joe Rogan and Theo Von and others come in. And Theo Von, had, Candace Owens on recently, right? So the point being that, what I'm trying to do is kind of show that the right not only is good at building networks in the way of you can have someone like Tucker Carlson legitimizing Nick Fuentes, and I would say there's also a lot of lifestyle and just niches in general that the right has been very effective at entering. And it's part of the reason something like, trad wives kind of started with this kind of crunchy, side of women trying to live a more natural life and that kind of thing. And so, I think rather than looking only at Nick Fuentes, what we have to look at is the system in which Nick Fuentes inhabits and how connected he is to that larger network. And the truth is, as time passes, he becomes more and more integrated into the larger network, and thus becomes, I would look again at his clips, how far they travel, look at, how much someone like Tucker Carlson giving him a voice leads to more audience and that kind of thing, to really track influence. And then to realize that Fuentes is just like kind of the most extreme example.
Why is the left comparatively bad at this stuff then? Like there were, after the election, there were all the conversations of like, there needs to be a progressive Joe Rogan, but of course there wasn't going to be, because you can't like manufacture a progressive Joe Rogan. I'm old enough to remember when right-wing talk radio first became really big, Rush Limbaugh in particular, and there was the freak out on the left that the left needs, progressives, Democrats need their own talk radio, and they created, I think it was Air America network that was supposed to be the progressive talk radio, and it went nowhere. It flopped and no longer exists. Like, sometimes there is an element of not recognizing how it is that the right is working in these cultural spaces. I think the Joe Rogan thing is like, if you tried to create a Joe Rogan who just gave progressive talking points, it wouldn't work, not just because they're progressive talking points, but because Joe Rogan's it's not politics all the time, and most of his listeners are tuning in for all the other stuff and then getting the political views along the way, or the way that like video game streamers or fitness influencers are a vector for this stuff. But if you just tried to do a left-wing fitness influencer who just centered the left-wingness, it wouldn't work because that's not what people are tuning in for. There's a lack of understanding, but there are a lot of people who do understand this. And yet there is not a there's not a significant like progressive Twitch community with the reach of the kind of more right-wing or manosphere. There's not a progressive fitness community in the way that the manosphere has. There's not really like a leftist Jordan Peterson. Um, why is that? Because that seems like if this is the vector of influence, having counter influence, you need to crack that. But it seems like the left has not figured out how to crack it at all.
Yeah. I mean, there are many reasons, many, many reasons. And I think it's so important for the left and for progressives and Democrats to really parse this all out. First of all, I would say that there actually are, like, Twitch is actually a great example. You have someone like Hassan Piker, who is actually extremely influential and has a big audience. But, to show an example of how, the left and Democrats have failed enormously in this respect is someone like Hassan going to not is going to, by definition, like, not fit into the mainstream. He's an influencer, which means he's more successful when he is edgy and when he is saying what he wants to say, as opposed to falling into like a talking point. And he got invited to the DNC, I think it was by the Harris campaign, or sorry, I should say the Democratic convention. I mean, and he was invited, and I think he said I'm trying to remember if it was because of something he said or if it was just his presence, but someone from the DNC told him he had to leave. He was there and then he had to leave. And the far right would never do that, or the Republican Party would never, at least at this point, for sure, would not do that, right? We saw TPUSA, I mean, and I think it was the Marifest or something, the conference I had recently, was replete with people, people use that as an example of the fracturing of the right, because there was, Ben Shapiro was calling out Tucker Carlson calling out Ben Shapiro and Candace Owens. And yes, that's true. There is this kind of internal war happening on the right, but at the same time, they were on the same stage and they were given the same platform. And that was partly because the right is purely interested in growth, like purely interested in power. They are less concerned with, in the example of like the Democratic Party, less concerned about maintaining a certain institutional approach and in, making sure that they have the right talking points. And anyone who doesn't have the right talking points is cut out of the institutions, right? The Republican Party is amazing, especially now, at bringing in, the worst case examples. And what that does is create a coalition. So the coalition is messy, the coalition is ugly, there's people getting constantly kicked out and brought in and all these things, but that's actually part of the effectiveness. It's, as I mentioned, it's a network of people working together to, at the very least, build power as a collective. The left doesn't do that in that way. And I think partly just because we don't understand how that works. And I think it has to do a lot with the fact that, the right is also sees things like algorithms, and I should say, like, the people on the right who are effective at this see things like algorithms as something they work against, right? Like the people on 4chan who were trying to make an audience on Twitter knew that if they wanted to be successful, they would have to market themselves in a way that, would kind of go against the algorithm because they didn't fit into it. So they got very effective at doing that. The outrage culture and that kind of thing was very effective. The left is more kind of lets itself be a reflexive reaction to the algorithm. So what ended up happening was, a really good example of this is, like, the right was outraging people on Twitter pre-Musk, was creating a lot of outrage, and the left would, ratio them. This was like the term at the time, was like you would get enough reaction and enough negativity, and they would, and from the left's perspective, from a lot of people on the left, their perspective was, wow, we won. We ratioed this person so badly. We had so many replies calling them out and so much quote tweets calling them out. And in reality, what they did was they were marketing. They were marketing the right. Their outrage gave the right a platform. It's a huge reason we are where we are. And it was the reason that Trump won the election. That kind of the kind of strategic approach from the right and reactionary approach from the left. And then you combine that with the fact that, in addition to the Democratic Party trying to keep institutionalism, there is also as has been true for decades, there is a huge issue with purity politics on the left right now that can create a situation where, like, a lot of people exist in these little echo chambers and don't reach out to each other and don't build networks. So they're really kind of going after the one thing that will be most effective at winning. Um, and obviously that requires strategic thinking, requires not working with people that are going to sacrifice other communities. But the opposite approach is just as bad, if not worse. And so that's on. I could go on and on. I think, like, the right has incredible funding that they put towards any influencer that helps them. Whereas, again, the Democratic Party and other funders are trying to be very, narrow in who they fund and who they don't fund. And that allows for, a lot of influencers being able to talk, be able to sit all day talking in a podcast, whereas, like, the rest of us have to get a job and stick in a podcast here and there. Right. That makes a big impact. So yeah, I could probably list 10 more things, but I'm going to bore you. Yeah.
As you were saying it, I was thinking about, we started this conversation. I mentioned what's going on at Heritage, and a functional nonprofit board that cared about being a steward of a venerable institution and maintaining that institution's principles and mission would have gotten rid of Heritage leadership quite some time ago, and definitely would be doing it now. But clearly, it's not a functional board, and it made me think of, I worked for most of the Obama administration and all of the first Trump administration. I worked for a large think tank in DC. And one of the things that became very clear when Trump came in was, like, not caring about expertise anymore. So Heritage, everyone's leaving. And that would be a big problem for an organization that cares about expertise and getting the scholarship right, because it's going to be hard to get quality scholars. But if you just want, like, hacks to come in and say right-wing things, then you have no problem refilling, like, your legal studies department. There are plenty of right-wing hack lawyers. And so the idea is, yes, it's not about getting the scholarship right. It's not about getting things like having expertise. It's just about exercising power, exercising influence, getting attention, and funding all of that happening. Which, I guess, to close this out, then it tees up so what do you do about it? Like, if this is this is a problem, and it's a problem that is likely to persist in some form even once Trump himself is behind us. The young men stewing in this stuff, like, maybe some of them grow out of it, but a lot of them won't. The internet doesn't seem like it's going to fix itself. And saying to the left, like, or just non-right wing groups, right? Like, the kind of big tent of, like, genuinely liberal people. If saying to them, well, you've got to give up, like, all of your kind of epistemic standards and desire for, like, protecting institutions and all of that, and just care about, like, winning culture war stuff the way the right does, and get down in the dirt and so on, like, that maybe, but that's a hard sell, and there are reasons to, like, not want a world where both sides are doing this sort of thing. So what do you do about it? What is the way forward in this moment as we're watching a whole lot of incredibly ugly stuff happening in the world, not just the US? It's like, you look at what's happening in the UK right now, it's a lot of similar sorts of ugliness. You are seeing a backlash. How big it is an open question, but you're seeing a lot of people really repelled by what is happening in a way that they weren't during the first Trump administration. Um, how do we navigate the next 3 years, 13 years, looking ahead? What's the way out of this, or the way forward?
Yeah. It's a great question. It's the question, right? I think, I gave Hassan as an example, but the truth is that, another example of a lost opportunity was one of the counterintuitive success stories of Biden's win, his first win, or only win, was the way in which BLM helped Biden win the election. A lot of people see BLM, Black Lives Matter, as kind of inherently oppositional to the system. But the truth was, Black Lives Matter was very invested in having Trump not win a re-election, and they put a lot of energy towards that. And if you look at the statistics and you look at the results of the election, you'll see that everywhere where BLM had like a very active chapter, the voting patterns there vastly shifted towards Biden, and in 2024 shifted the other way. It's not to say that BLM is purely the reason for this stuff, but it is a really good example of, like, Hassan is one person. BLM was actually is a literal network of groups working. They call themselves a network. And they had an opportunity or I should say, the Democratic Party had an opportunity to integrate them. That obviously didn't work. And I think what's happening now is part of the reason I tend to be anti-institutional in many respects is not because I don't believe in the power of institutions, but I believe that the people in the institutions are so invested in maintaining them, in the Democratic Party and the left in general, or the center left in general, that we really need to keep building power, alternate power on the left. And that means, and that we've actually seen successes with that, if you're willing to see it as success. Something like Mamdani winning an election, in my opinion, is an example of the success of the pro-democracy movement. A lot of people in the center left might not see it that way, but it's a really good example of what happens when enough people are invested in having a kind of coalition between the left, the far left, and the center left. I think a lot of people in the center left didn't want Cuomo to win. And even if they weren't huge fans of Mamdani, voted for him. AOC is also another example. There's Bernie Sanders, and we're seeing how this group of people is helping bring like a true democratic movement. And what I mean by that is we're seeing, there's so many examples of institutional Democrats, corporations, a million examples of people just kind of giving up to fascism and authoritarianism. Like when Trump, puts pressure on them, they fold very quickly. And this group of people is not doing that. And it doesn't have to only be them, of course. There's an example of I'm trying to remember his name, but the Democratic politician in Texas who speaks kind of more to the Christian angle of this and is a Democrat. And, I would consider him also part of this group that are willing to truly resist. And what we're seeing with that group is that the center left and others are starting to really gravitate towards them, not necessarily because they agree with them, but because they understand that the institution's not standing with them, and they need to be with any group that is genuinely willing to risk a lot to stand up to Trump. So I would actually argue we have a lot of hope. There's a lot happening. People need to be able to kind of see what's happening, open themselves up to it. We need to bring people along. And I think we're really going to find that by building more solidarity movements. I think BLM was like this massive example that's still underappreciated in what it accomplished, but we have an opportunity to kind of enter the next stage of that and make it not just centered in terms of rhetoric on one group, but to really make it a solidarity movement at large. And I think as immigrant groups and trans people and Jews are being targeted, the ironic reality of that is it may lead, hopefully it'll lead to many of us starting to understand, the people who were resistant to seeing it before, understanding that we're not going to get out of this without each other. And so there are a ton of niche networks, if we're going back to the network language, that can work together and make massive change. What we need to do is keep educating people about that. I do think a lot of people, both at the top and in the grassroots, need to be educated about this so that they can connect with each other. We can stop having these echo chambers and we can start really building something. I don't think that's going to happen overnight. I think there's going to have to be a lot of time invested in it. The right spent so much time investing in this that we're really playing catch up. But I think we have a lot of potential, and I think we just have to be willing. We have to be willing to sacrifice. We have to be willing to work with others, and we have to really believe in true solidarity.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode of Reimagining Liberty. If you'd like to listen to future episodes free of ads and sponsorships, you can become a supporter for just a few dollars a month. Head to www.aaronrosspowell.com to learn more.